Happy Memorial Day, friends. I'm Key from Travel Made Personal. The first stop on our third Alabama road trip in February of this year was Olustee Battlefield State Park in Olustee, Florida. I thought it a fitting stop to talk about for Memorial Day so we can honor those who have paid the ultimate price for our freedom. The Battle of Olustee was also known as the Battle of Ocean Pond because of how close it is to Ocean Pond in the Osceola National Forest. Ocean Pond is immediately north of where the Battle of Olustee took place on February 20th, 1864. It's pretty common for Civil War battles to have multiple names. The Confederate forces actually anchored part of their defensive lines near the pond, taking advantage of the natural terrain, which included the pond and surrounding swamps. It gave them a strategic advantage to limit Union flanking movements. So the local residents and some Confederate sources referred to it as the Battle of Ocean Pond, but the Battle of Olustee became the most commonly used name due to the Florida Railroad station at Olustee being a nearby landmark. Anyway, the Battle of Olustee was the largest Civil War battle fought in Florida, and it took place in Baker County near present-day Lake City. Now, it is commemorated at the Olustee Battlefield Historic State Park. Dusty had visited the park before and wanted me to see it. We attempted to go see it on our second Alabama road trip last year, but the GPS and my ADHD were giving us issues, so we didn't make it in time for that trip. Because it was important to us, we made it the first stop on our third Alabama road trip just to make sure we didn't miss it again. So in early 1864, the Union was looking to disrupt the Confederate supply lines in Florida and recruit formerly enslaved African Americans into the Union Army. They wanted to restore Florida to the Union in time for the 1864 election. On February 17, 1864, commanded by Brigadier General Truman Seymour, the Union troops, which included white regiments and African American units such as the 54th Massachusetts and the 8th U.S. Colored Troops, marched west from Jacksonville toward the interior before being met by entrenched Confederate forces near Olustee Station. Captain Robert Park of Alabama stated, "We had no idea there would be a real battle in Florida, but when the Yankees came, we gave them the same warm welcome we'd give them in Virginia." Both sides were pretty evenly matched for this battle. The Union Army had somewhere between 5,500 and 5,800 troops, while the Confederate forces were between 5,000 and 5,400 men. The Union had 16 to 20 guns, while the Confederates had maybe 12, but the Confederate side had more extensive cavalry units from Florida cavalry companies. Fighting began in the early afternoon and lasted several hours. General Seymour did not do adequate scouting and underestimated Confederate strength. His poor reconnaissance was due to his expectation that the Confederate troops were made up of only militia or scattered resistance in the area. Because of that, he had Union troops arriving on the battlefield in staggered formations instead of a unified force. As each Union regiment arrived, it was thrown into the fight in a piecemeal fashion, which diluted their combat effectiveness. They used traditional line infantry tactics, advancing in linear formations across open ground toward fortified positions, which made them vulnerable to Confederate musket and artillery fire. Private James Monroe Trotter from the 55th Massachusetts said, "The rebels came upon us with terrible force. Our men fell like grass before the scythe. Yet still we stood and fought. It was our blood that watered the field, and our courage that saved the army. The Confederate forces, led by Brigadier General Joseph Finnegan, actually included units from Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. Since Finnegan chose such a strong defensive position near Olustee Station by a narrow stretch of pine flatwoods flanked by swamps and Ocean Pond, the Confederates were able to restrict Union flanking maneuvers and force them into a frontal assault. Confederate forces were positioned behind breastworks using railroad embankments and natural cover to minimize their exposure to artillery fire. Finnegan also withheld part of his force in reserve, which allowed him to gradually commit reinforcements to hold the line and exploit Union exhaustion. Union troops attempted to extend their lines and outmaneuver the Confederate because the terrain and Confederate positioning limited effective flanking, but those efforts failed because the battlefield was so narrow. The Union troops suffered a lack of coordination, and the arrival of Confederate reinforcements restored and strengthened the Confederate line. In fact, Private George Watson of the 19th Georgia Infantry said, "We held the line under fire for hours. The Yankees kept coming, but they broke each time. We gave them the what for, and they ran." Both sides deployed artillery batteries, but with guns placed to cover open areas and disrupt Union troop movement, the Confederates had better positioning. The dense pine terrain and lack of good vantage points made the Union artillery less effective and difficult to coordinate. The Union Army suffered heavy casualties, over 1,800, while the Confederates suffered only about half of that, somewhere around 950. So as the Union lines broke and casualties mounted, General Seymour ordered a tactical retreat toward Baldwin and then Jacksonville. While disorganized, the withdrawal was disciplined, as it was aided by rearguard units and cavalry that screened the retreat from Confederate pursuit. A soldier of the 54th Massachusetts noted, "We were the last to leave the field, held the rebels back until all had gone. We brought off the wounded, our colors, and our honor." And General Seymour reported, "The enemy fought with stubbornness, and his fire was constant and severe. My regiments were too widely extended, and the field was ill-suited for the kind of action forced upon us." As a result, the Confederates won the Battle of Olustee on February 20th, 1864, and halted the Union's attempt to cut off Florida from the Confederacy and disrupt Southern supply lines. The defeat dampened Union efforts in Florida for the remainder of the war, limiting their control largely to the coastal areas of Jacksonville. The Union retreated to Jacksonville, which it held for the rest of the war, but made no further major inland advances. General Finnegan, in his official report, stated, "Our men displayed extraordinary bravery and composure under heavy fire. They repelled each assault and held their ground, inflicting great loss." One thing the Battle of Olustee was notable for was the bravery of African American soldiers, whose performance helped dispel doubts about their capabilities in combat. They were deployed late in the battle to cover the Union retreat, but despite being undertrained compared to other units, these regiments performed admirably under fire, conducting the rearguard actions that helped prevent a total rout. In recent years, there have been many debates and discussions over adding monuments to honor African American soldiers at the Olustee Battlefield Historic Site. A proposal to erect a state-sanctioned monument to honor African American Union soldiers who fought and died in the Battle of Olustee came about in the early 2010s because African American troops played a crucial role and suffered heavy casualties during the Union retreat. Their valor and sacrifice were largely unrecognized at the site, which mainly focused on Confederate memory. Supporters wanted a monument to acknowledge black soldiers' contributions and to present a more complete, inclusive history. Some state lawmakers and Confederate heritage groups opposed the proposal, stating that placing the monument near existing Confederate memorials was revisionist history, politically driven, and disrespectful to Confederate dead already memorialized there because the site has been a Confederate commemoration for over 100 years. They claimed that the Union monument could disrupt the balance of remembrance or dishonor Confederate heritage, and some saw it as a modern political intrusion into a sacred historic site. Veterans groups, historians, and civil rights organizations argued that all of the Union dead, including African Americans, deserve equal recognition at a site where they fought and died, and that not including them reinforces a selective narrative of the Civil War. They argued that the monument would promote historical accuracy and racial reconciliation. State NAACP and other civic groups supported the effort, arguing the battlefield must reflect the full spectrum of those who served and died there. The final decision, after intense debate, was to not install a major monument specifically honoring African American Union troops. While the Olustee Battlefield Historic State Park does contain some interpretive signage and exhibits acknowledging black troops, it doesn't have a standalone monument comparable to the Confederate obelisk that the United Daughters of the Confederacy erected in 1912 to commemorate the Confederate soldiers who fought at Olustee. In 1897, the United Daughters of the Confederacy began commemorating the battlefield. The park was established in 1912 and became Florida's first state historic site. An annual reenactment of the battle is held every February. The controversy surrounding whether or not to put up a Union monument or one commemorating African American Union troops is part of a larger national debate over how Civil War history is remembered and taught, the role of Confederate monuments in public spaces, and the visibility of African American military contributions in U.S. history. This is a hard discussion to have. Beliefs are a funky thing. People believe what they believe because of a complicated combination of factors such as pre-existing mental frameworks, social influences, emotional responses, and cognitive biases. They're often deeply ingrained and resistant to change, even when presented with contradictory evidence. We don't have direct volitional control over our beliefs, but we can influence them through conscious efforts like seeking out evidence, evaluating arguments, and being open to new information. Our beliefs are shaped by our experiences, cultural influences, and information we receive. What I believe personally, as a veteran of the United States military, is that anybody that fought for this country, especially those who died while doing so, should be memorialized and commemorated. The Civil War is some of the darkest history of this country, but in order for it to not be repeated again, we must learn from our past mistakes and grow from them. I believe that both sides, the Union and the Confederate forces, truly believed they were fighting for the greater good. I believe that the dead don't have the capacity to feel disrespected. I believe that our country's historic sites should represent the facts of the battles, memorialize the troops that fought those battles, and stop accepting divisive narratives that continue to exclude certain groups of people for things beyond their control. And that's on me. So what do you believe? Let me know in the comments below. Let's have a civilized discussion. I hope you learned something new today. I've found that I learn so much by visiting these historic sites scattered throughout our country, and I'm always fascinated with the stories I hear when I visit them. The Civil War was ugly. Visiting the Civil War battlegrounds reminds me that they didn't have the abundance of information that we have today. The living history events typically include portrayals of both Union and Confederate forces, including reenactors representing U.S. colored troops. This helps me put the events and viewpoints into perspective. When Dusty and I visited Olustee Battlefield, it was not during the month of February when they had reenactments going on. In fact, we were literally the only people there at the park that day. We didn't even see any park staff. We stopped at the small visitor center and explored the artifacts they had on display there. Then we walked around the outside of the building and visited the monuments before taking a walk through the actual battlefield. We finished off this visit at the small cemetery just outside the park. While the cemetery is not a part of the park and does not represent the troops that fell during this battle, it felt appropriate to stop and pay our respects to the fallen. As you celebrate Memorial Day today, I hope you also reflect on the sacrifices that have been made for this country. Today is about honoring and remembering those who lost their lives fighting for what they believed in. I mentioned in a previous video that I wasn't taking video footage during our first Alabama road trip. I did start taking video on the second trip though, and we revisited some of the sites from the first trip to get the video footage to share with you. Since I didn't have video footage from the first trip, I started this channel by jumping around to different sites we visited. I think next week I'm going to start back at the first stop of the first trip and go in order so you can see how our trips progressed. We started with the old U.S. Arsenal, which is now the Florida State Hospital. We've taken maybe a dozen trips since then, so I have a ton to share with you. Be sure to stay tuned for that. Also, be sure to like and subscribe so you'll get notified as those videos get released. But for now, get out there and explore the world your way.